Hello, I'm Mike Buchanan, the founder and leader of the political party Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them. I'm joined today for an interview of Richard Joy by Elizabeth Hobson, an anti-feminist gender equality activist. Richard is an author, speaker, and men's group facilitator who founded and runs the organization Awakened Men. At a time when paths of growth and initiation are all but obsolete, which has led to a generation of males without personal, cultural, and spiritual guidance, he seeks to aid in the rebuilding of men. Richard's work draws highly from the traditions within men's work and his personal experience. After growing up in a single-parent household and losing his brother to drug addiction, he dealt with that pain by entering the world of woke academia, at one time buying into the feminist dogma of toxic masculinity and political correctness as a lost and impressionable young man. However, after a deeply challenging time in his life, his presuppositions were confronted, leading to a transformational experience. After this, he rebuilt his life, finding a deep sense of meaning in finding himself as a man and walking a path of initiation. This led to the foundation of Awakened Man, an organization that runs men's groups, offers one-on-one mentoring, and hosts a media channel focusing on spiritual and personal development, initiation processes, and countering the politically correct drive to lie about men and masculinity. This is all done in the fundamental realization that strong, healthy males lead to strong, healthy societies. Henceforth, by building the man, you empower the family, the community, and the society at large. Richard, finally, a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. In your work, Richard, you speak a lot about the dissolution of the father in different ways. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so this is really the core of Awakened Man and the work that I really do with young men specifically. And it really began with my own experiences of growing up as a young man. In fact, just before this call, I was just chatting to another young guy I'm doing some work with, saying about, I just had no idea what it meant to be a man. I had no guidance. I had no real positive image of masculinity. And henceforth, I was I was very lost in myself, lost in the world. And as you pointed out in the intro there, that drew me towards sort of the woke politics of the time. That was kind of how you fit in. And because of my own inner baggage, my own inner issues, I was kind of almost biting back against the world, trying to seek some sense of meaning or identity in that. But as my life started to get worse and worse, and I started to become more and more lost, and then essentially having this rebirth type experience where I was able to rebuild my life, I really started to look around and see that there were lots of men struggling like I did. And I could really see it once I started to get over myself and my own self-obsession, that there were lots of people like this. And as I started to put my life back together, I went through several processes. First of all, I connected with my own father. So that meant dealing with the issues that had happened, looking at him in a different light as he was, rather than as I told myself he was, recognizing the value that he gave my life, and really building a new identity which was rooted upon our genuine connection, rather than something which I'd inculcated through, you could say, my own pain and even some of the material I was reading. So that was step number one, reconnecting with my actual father. And secondly, there was also the reconnection with what I call the cultural father. Now, again, because of the nature of my upbringing and the nature of the education that I'd had, I'd never really been told there was anything good about Britain, ever. And I think I grew up in a world where I was told it was just a colonial monster that's never offered anything to the world apart from oppression and pain and brutality. And again, when you're young, you kind of have this iconoclastic side to you, or at least I did, and you kind of want to jump aboard with that. And you get on with people easy. It makes you think you're cool. You get into kind of alternative music, drugs as well. I think all these things come together. And for me, there was this realization that I thought, well, hang on a minute, like, is it really that bad? Is really what I'm saying quite as bad as I'm making it out to be? And I think there was something I was reading at the time about It was actually a spiritual book, and it was saying that one of the worst problems is these people who consistently want to complain about the world. They constantly want to say like the world's full of all these problems, and they never really respect what they have. And usually these people have an issue in themselves rather than in the world. And I started to really take that message on. And I started to think like, has that been my story too? Have I been basically externalizing all this stuff in my own life and falling into this kind of subsect, which seems to critique the world and really bring down what is essentially my own identity? And then I started to look a bit more into what my culture actually meant. Who was the man that my grandfather was, for instance? Who were these people who fought in the war? What did they actually think? What sort of men were they? And then I started to think a bit more about the luck I'd have in just being English, being born in England, with the tradition of English libertarianism, of English freedom, of being able to think and speak and be the man you want to be. I started to realize like, this actually isn't that bad. This is quite good. And I started to feel very free because of that. And then I started to see that I realized I was part of this kind of cultural ancestry, if you will, that I really felt that no one had ever told me about. I was just told the counter of it. So it really gave me this grounding in a sense of my own culture, if you will. Now, I'm not saying that every single person has to be completely, standing by a picture of the Queen and singing the national anthem in the morning. It's not the point I'm making, but I grew up in a city like Leicester, where they were very eager to talk about, like Pakistani identity, Indian identity, which is fine, enjoy their identity. But I started to think like, what's mine, and then I was in London. I realized, most of my friends like half Italian or half Ghanaian or whatever, and they were kind of attached to these identities. But my one was kind of seen as this like, it's kind of bad to somehow have it. And by no means it was like turning down this like very dark, extreme path like people tell you are when you identify with what I call cultural fault. It wasn't like that at all. It was just a simple acknowledgement that there's a certain lifestyle, a certain set of cultural values which I'd ignored. And as soon as I adopted, I started to feel a bit more at home. So that was the second stage. And then thirdly was the notion of what you might call, I suppose in the Christian tradition, God the Father. Now, that for me, I'm not necessarily a religious person, but for me, there was a big spiritual element to my life in that I was very lost in my own narratives, in trying to sort of pin some sort of blame on the world. And when I had this experience in my own life of really falling apart, all of that had to go. So I really just became very rooted just as I was, neutral. And I started to see that there was a much deeper sense of being involved in that. And now I won't go into the spiritual journey that led me onto, but it did give me an understanding of what this fundamental notion of God the Father means, both spiritually and culturally, i.e. it's a guidance, it's something which you can sink into and offer you meaning and direction in your life. Now, once I had those three in place, I started to find that for the first time in my life, I actually had peace. Like I had peace inside of me. I felt okay. And I was looking at the world, at these young guys, and they were going the other way. And I was thinking some of these guys had worse experiences than me, some of them not so bad. But they didn't seem to be really fundamentally healing. And then when I get speaking to them, I always remember this. This is, in fact, one of the things that led me to start Awaken Man. This young fella, really nice young guy, private school educated, posh English person. And I was at this like men's group with him. And there was this break halfway through. And we went outside and I was just chatting to him. And he said in this posh English way, he goes, I'm really enjoying this evening, but I'm really going to have to watch my toxic masculinity. I remember thinking like, mate, you need some toxic masculinity. Like you need this drive, this essence, this kind of unapologetic desire to go out in the world and be forthright. You don't need to apologize for your existence anymore. And just speaking to him, he was one of these guys who said sorry with almost every opinion he had. He would be sort of like very flinching when you'd speak to him. And I'm thinking like, what are we telling these young men? That they're bad and they need to be careful of their masculinity, otherwise it's going to like leap on somebody in the dark. And you think, what's happened here? So I've never been of the notion that, that there's never examples of men who don't behave in a good way. I'm fully aware there are. I mean, I've had many dark experiences of my own and things I had to come to terms with. But that said, we almost live in this society now where men are told this single-minded story. This is how men behave, and these decent guys just fall into this trap of thinking that's how they come across. And another thing I started to see with guys like that in my own experience was they just couldn't have balanced relationships with men or women because they were constantly apologetic. It was hard for a woman to really be around a guy like that because he was so up and down and unable to be balanced in a relationship and kind of lost and apologetic for his own existence. And other men, you couldn't really connect with him or guys like that because there's nothing really there to connect to. They haven't really found themselves. So all in all, I started to realize this notion of what I call the father, with a capital F. And my work is very much about re-implementing that. Earthly, making peace with your father where possible. I understand it's not easy for every single person. Many guys I work with can't do that. Their fathers might have passed away, or sometimes there's very difficult family circumstances. But where possible, making peace with your father, and certainly not going around hating him, because that's quite a dangerous thing to do. Same culturally. Again, I'm not saying you have to turn into a total royalist or anything like that, but just at least be a bit more balanced about your culture. You don't have to hate anything. You can dislike things, you can disagree by all means. But this hatred, that's the key. And really starting to understand the value systems that have molded us as individuals. Again, once I started to realize that, I just had such a deep sense of gratitude for my ancestors, for being born where I was, for coming from where I came from. Because as I say, it gave me this really deep understanding that these people have come before me that have worked the world out for me. They've given me such a wonderful opportunity to do what I do now, to be able to work on my own business, to be able to go and try and achieve what I want to achieve, to be able to speak freely. These are things that people have actually paid for. And again, if you don't know that, you just turn your existence into a very dark and bleak place. And then finally, as I say, for me, another big step was coming back to this notion of God the Father. It doesn't necessarily mean Christianity, but again, I think being part of a post-Christian tradition, it's important to understand those moral value systems. So I hope that gives you a brief but well-rounded view of what the Father essentially means.
That was really interesting. Thank you for that. There's some remarkable parallels with my own kind of journey, actually, which we'll have to talk about at another time if you don't mind. But I was wondering, you predominantly work with younger men, and I'm wondering why that is and what is unique about their experience of the world.
Yeah. So there's two main reasons for that. First of all, I think from going to men's groups myself, I started to realize that the older guys really had more of a focus on this desire to, let's say, speak freely. That was very much their focus. And mainly, I think, because they had stronger fathers. So whereas we started with that kind of mentality in the men's groups, it really grew more out into me recognizing that the guys who are a bit younger, they actually wanted a role model. They'd never had like a role model, a strong fatherly type figure. And that's why a lot of them were there. So they didn't want to come to another place and talk about their feelings, quote unquote, because society tells them to do that all the time anyway. They'd never actually had fatherly type figures, but more stern, tough love type figures. And I started to pick up on that. I think, well, what's going on? Like, why is there this differential? And then the second reason started to make more sense. Well, I think, again, lots of men in this day and age, and that's my experience too, were really raised in single parent families. Like the environment I grew up in, it was pretty much 50% divorce. I've got friends in London who say they grew up in environments where it was 90% single parent families. So lads growing up with their mothers. So there seems to be this big cultural shift has happened where you've got a generation of young men who don't really have any connection to a mature, safe and stable sense of masculinity. I think that's deeply, deeply destabilizing for a young man. I think when they don't have that, they go one or two ways. They either get anxious because they don't know how to deal with the world, or they can get aggressive. And then I think that's all the kind of hyper masculinity, if you will, comes in, sort of gang culture or the excessive gangster rap type stuff that guys gravitate to. And, I was having this conversation with someone the other day when my friend was sort of laughing at one of our old friends who has adopted this sort of gangster rap persona despite being from Leicester or Leicestershire, really like a simple middle-class town in Leicester or village in Leicester. And he's adopted these kind of mannerisms of Black New York. And you think, well, it's bizarre, but in a way, it's the only kind of form of masculinity that he can actually embody where he won't really be laughed at. So if he adopts this persona of being tough and aggressive and kind of unreachable, it allows him to express himself in this way. And again, I think it's sad because these lads adopt these other forms of sort of, if you will, these hyper-masculinity forms, which are based on aggression. It really is defense mechanisms. So what I'm really getting to here is, I think this generation of young men have been particularly lost. So there's that real fatherly figure has not been there to guide them and really introduce them into a form of what it means to be a man, of what it means to hold the values of a man, so to speak. And that's really what got me interested in processes of initiation as well. And that, again, is a real core element of what I do. So it's not just kind of men's coaching, sitting around, what do you want to do with your life, that sort of stuff. It's much more this process of passing on from these elements of boy psychology, as I call it, into a space of man psychology. And what is initiation historically? Well, it's really where the men of a tribe would come and hold the younger boys. And usually they challenge them, really challenge them. It would be quite tough, some of the things they get them to do, but it will be as an introduction to pain, to teach them how to deal with difficulty and adversity. And again, we're just not teaching young guys this anymore. So they grow up sometimes into 20, 30, even into their 40s, and they've had no introduction into this sort of thing. So that's where someone like me comes in. And originally I just started putting videos out there and just started, speaking on what my thoughts were and see what the response would be. But I definitely noticed immediately that the audience that was drawn to it were young men who just never been told this. And again, as I was talking about in the fathers earlier, they hadn't had that environment. So to them, it sort of sparked something inside of them. And again, I think because of my own age, I'm 35 at this point, I do believe that you need an older man to guide you. So in my own life, I look up to elder men. There's many men who've reached out to me in my own videos, and I value their input and their guidance because I think we need that as men. So it's important for me to try and give a lift up to people who are, 5, 10 years younger than me. So in essence, that's why this is focused on younger men.
Mm.
I'd just like to ask, we've sort of touched on fatherlessness there, Richard. It's obviously a major driver of societal ills, crime and so much more. And best described, I think, best explored by Dr. Warren Farrell in The Boy Crisis. Parental alienation by mothers, mainly by mothers, not solely, but mainly by mothers, is at last being recognized as a form of domestic abuse. And one has to wonder just how many boys and young men have basically sort of swallowed hook, line, and sinker what their mothers have told them about their fathers, and how do many of them, in your experience, try and I guess a lot of these males are going to go through life never giving their father the chance to put his side of the story, and my God, they have a side of the story.
Well, that's an excellent point. And that really does come down to the real nitty gritty of the work that I'm doing with lots of men. And, hopefully you'll be cheered to hear that lots of men that I work with do come to that realization. They do start to think like, maybe everything I've been told isn't exactly true about my father. Mm. And we do have to explore that together. And of course, I think there's a really important point to make here. The key is, of course, you're not trying to be angry at anybody. We're not trying to make them stop blaming their father and start blaming their mother, but we have to start understanding some of the dynamics at play. And, I think back to my own experience and the experience of many men like me. There was a cultural drive. I've always been very keen to express to Americans, my parents got divorced in 1997. That's when Tony Blair came to power. That was New Labour. So it was almost a wash in that generational change. And when I think back, I don't blame my mother, but I can see she was caught up in that cultural fervor, if you will, of, I can go away and do my own thing. You don't need a man around. I can raise my boys myself. Men just bring in this energy, which we don't need, et cetera, et cetera. And that was, I think, a message that lots of women were picking up on. And I think as well, I don't blame my mother, because I've come to see that very often lots of women get stuck in that overprotective type mentality towards their kids. And I think a lot of guys are calling it enmeshment now, that they're being too tightly held by the mother, and they're almost being suffocated in that hold. And they need to almost break free of that hold. But you don't do that with anger. You do that by, going through an experience of initiation, in my point of view. But I also started to look back, and lots of men do this, I think, when they do the work, to their own experiences, and think about what they were told. And a lot of them would turn into surrogate husbands, basically, without them knowing. So usually 12, 13, 14, they'd hear things about their dad. And you hear lots of guys say, you know what, my mum said a lot of bad things about my dad, but my dad never really did. They never said that many bad things about my mum. And again, I think that very often why that happens is because a mother is trying to almost justify why she got rid of dad. So she wants to express her point of view to the kid, but she doesn't realize she's really damaging the kid by basically splitting them apart. And you get this terrible thing where, it's what happened to me as well, you have perfect mother and bad father. And the reality is usually somewhere a bit more in the middle, And until you can get back to that place, you're really going to struggle a lot. So in my eyes, it's an absolutely essential journey that men have to go on. And we won't be free until we do that work either. We do look within and start to actually make sense of what happened, and understand that mothers and fathers work in different ways. Like I say, it took me to get to about 30 before I started to really realize that, my dad just had a different vision for what he was building. He was more traditional. He was trying to lead a family in a sort of nuclear family type model. And as soon as I sort of understood that and understood his point of view, you could see how badly it damaged him, the divorce, and by extension, me and especially my brother, who really ended up getting on a very negative path. That, look, there were steps he took that didn't help himself, but it really was the catalyst which put him on a bad path. And many other young guys who get involved in drugs and all manner of things because there's no authoritative father figure there. But again, more broadly, it's still very one-sided. I think it really is still very one-sided, and men are getting a very tough crack of the whip even still. Again, today I was just making a bit of content on what happens to men in divorce courts. It's not exactly my specialism, but I do communicate that, obviously, because guys who've been through that usually a bit older. But the stories you hear there are just tragic. Just breaks men to shreds. So again, I think unfortunately, it is something which at this point is unfortunately unspoken in our society. But I think, again, it comes back to this cultural issue I'm speaking of. Why I think the cultural father is so important is because right now we've got a cultural mother, and the ethos of the time, I think, is a bit more in that motherly energy. Henceforth, the father side of things isn't really heard as much as it should be. And for men, it's essential that they hear that.
Indeed. I mean, the average, sorry, how do I put this? The suicide rates among men in the UK has for some years been around 3.5 times larger than that for women, but it triples after family court experiences, and mainly because men are denied access to their children in huge numbers. And we wouldn't be surprised to see mothers killing themselves if they're denied access to their children. But there's a complete lack of humanity towards fathers doing that. But it is. I have 2 daughters, and they were about 7 and 9 when the family broke up. And I was lucky that I kept on seeing them. I now know myself well enough that had I been denied access to them for possibly years, I don't think I'd be here today, Richard. I think it says a lot for men's stoicism and resilience that so many men actually survive the unspeakably cruel. But coming on to my next question, you seem to have some ambivalence, Richard, towards the modern media's notions of men sharing their feelings. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, so this is a big one for me. Now, I think I started to notice this language coming in on The Guardian and the BBC and all the usual culprits. And immediately, I was thinking, there's something about this isn't quite right. Usually they've got some kind of agenda. And I'm not against, if a guy's gone through some massive trauma, he needs to be able to share that. But I'm a big believer, that's why I really like men's groups. Men need to be able to connect together in a safe environment where you've got guys on your team and you feel safe. But it's almost a drive at this point to get men to be very almost soppy and weak and almost pathetic in just day-to-day life is not going to help men. It doesn't help them in their career lives. It definitely doesn't help them in their personal lives. In fact, it just makes them a lot worse. I was having this conversation, and before I started actually working on Awaken Man solely, I was doing a bit of freelance work in many offices in London, which are surprisingly woke for the corporate world these days. But, I remember this one girl was telling me, like, men really need to share about their feelings all the time. And if they need to cry, come in and cry and all this sort of stuff. And I was thinking, well, look, I'm your boss basically at this point. If I came in and was crying every day, would you look up to me? Would you be able to respect me? Would you really listen to what I was going to say? And you could see she was like, no, but it was one of these things where she couldn't say it. And why I think it's negative is it's not really teaching men to actually deal with their difficulties in a healthy way. Part of becoming a man and growing into a man is learning how to deal with challenges and not falling into our emotions immediately. Yes, there are times where there might be an incredibly difficult situation or traumatic event where you need to connect with another guy. You need to explore that, fair enough. But this constant drive to being lost in your feelings, to letting your feelings dominate you, I think it comes from a general dislike and distrust of the masculine principle, which for me, again, is that stoic nature. I think back to my grandfather, who's a great man. He lost his wife when he was young and raised my mother essentially alone for a while. But he got on, he had this stoic approach to it. He pushed through and he was a good man and he provided balance for my mother and in later life for me as well. So first of all, that's in a sort of practical sense, but I think in my own personal experience, I was given that advice for a long time and I found I was just awash in emotion and feelings, not knowing what to do, almost haunted by every emotion and feeling that went on inside of me. And until I went on my own little journey to realize you're not your emotions, you don't have to be governed by them, you don't have to pour them out every single day. You can actually practice it just being like, look, this is a tough experience. I'm not going to complain. I'm not going to cry about it. I'm just going to face it. And I'm going to try and provide that stability for the people at work, for the relationship I'm in, for my family, etc. And that for me is what makes a good man. I think we all intuitively know that, the great movies that men are drawn to, like a movie like Gladiator, we're drawn to it because it's a man who doesn't just break down and start whining and crying, complaining. He faces adversity. He faces the danger. Now, does that mean we're going to judge him if he sheds a tear in a quiet moment? Of course not. But he's willing to face challenge and difficulty and overcome. And I think that's such a good example for men to follow. It's such an inspirational model for men to follow. And again,
it's Richard, it's how resilience is built, of course. I mean, women are used when they talk about their problems, they expect help and support because they get it. Men soon learn that they probably won't. But you take a situation, a man who's denied access to his children is absolutely devastated by that. What in the name of God is the point in talking about that? How does that change reality? It doesn't. And the men who survive are the ones who, some of them eventually, and a good example is Greg Ellis, a Hollywood actor who we're going to interview shortly. He wrote a book called The Respondent. And he realizes he's never going to see his sons again. It's devastating for him. But he had to have a sort of ceremony. I can't remember quite what he called it, but it's like a funeral where he just had to accept he was never going to see them again and move on. And that was his way of healing, at least to a degree that he could get on with his life. Otherwise, the pain is too great. And at the point before he got to that realization, he walked to or drove to a bridge. He lives in California, and and he was ready to jump off, as so many do. But it's a cruel message to tell men to speak about their feelings when the things that are churning up their feelings are not going to be solved.
Well, I think that's very true as well. And I think there's also another element at play in there as well, of, again, a fundamental misunderstanding, which goes against the egalitarian worldview we have today, that men and women are different. And men often deal with things in a different way. Like, men very often like a process, a goal-oriented mission that they can go on to break free of whatever it is that torments them, to overcome whatever it is that torments them. And again, I mean, I've had this experience with my partner in my own life, you know, where something will be going on in her life, and she's got that emotional fluency where she can talk about it and almost sort of transmute whatever it is that she's going through into this kind of emotional expression. But for me, my instinct is more to provide a solution, you know, and that's the way I work. And again, that's okay. You know, that's all right. And again, I think men are told that there's something wrong with that. They shouldn't do that. And again, that was a major part of what I've built here at Awaken Man, because, you know, I went down the therapy route for a while and it helped for a bit. But I found they got trapped in that, let's just go over and over and over what's gone wrong and stay in the emotions. And basically, they don't care if you don't really get better, because, of course, they just get paid and the cycle continues. But I started to realize, like, what I really wanted was a process, something where I could use this energy, this pain inside, use this fear, and actually start to move forward in my life, to face those challenges, to overcome. And again, I was lucky to meet men who I mean, God, I remember I met this guy. It was really stuck experience. Like, I told him my big, whole, terrible victim story, and, you know, it's full of pain, but I'd only ever told it to, like, therapists or people who'd feel sorry for me before. And he said to me, he went, "Oh, that's really sad. I'm sorry to hear about that. What are you going to do about it?" You know, I remember it really hit me like an arrow to the chest. I was like, no one's ever said that before. I respected him for saying it. Like, I really did. It was really what I needed. And originally I was like, God, like, almost how dare you type thing. But I thought, like, yeah, this is interesting. And what it really gave me was a sense of agency. It made me think, like, I'm not a victim to all of these emotions. I can do something. I can go on this process. And again, that was what fundamentally changed my life. And I think men are yearning for that sort of thing. I think that's why Jordan Peterson, who we spoke about earlier, is so popular, because he does offer men that, something they can actually do, and tell them, like, pull yourself together. You've got a massive opportunity here. And I think that's why young men have flocked to a voice like that.
You mentioned initiation earlier, historically. But a lot of your work centers around the idea of initiation, and I'm wondering if you can explain what that means in your work in this modern context.
Yeah. So, of course, sort of historic initiation was a lot more of a dramatic process. If you tried to do that today, you'd probably get in quite a lot of trouble with the sort of health and safety types quite quickly. So in the sort of traditional sense of the word, you can't really engage in a true initiation. But I mean, in essence, what it's really pointing towards, one of my favorite stories of initiation, is this tribe out in Brazil where the mothers would be in on the initiation, and they know what was going to happen, but they'd hold on to their boys who are about 11 at this point, and the men of the tribe would go away on a hunting trip, quote unquote, and then come back late in the night and take the men away to almost scare them, and the women would know.
Sorry, Richard, take the boys away, do you mean?
Yeah, sorry, the men would come back and take the boys away. Yeah. And then, sorry, I maybe misspoke there.
That's okay.
And they would take them out into the wild to introduce them to the wild, to introduce them to challenge, to introduce them to pain even. Now, of course, you couldn't do that in this day and age, but you think, well, why were they doing that? Like, what was the value of it? Because it can seem quite cruel to us. What they were really trying to do was embed in these young men an understanding of how to handle adversity and trauma and difficulty. And of course, they'd recognize that they were with their peers, they're with other young boys, they're with other men in this wild environment. They would introduce them to true adversity and difficulty. And then, of course, they'd come back to the tribe again as men. It was like their rites of passage. So I think that these were pretty much cross-cultural, you know, really throughout history. But in our modern day and age, we've become excessively civilized. The welfare state is huge. And henceforth, a lot of men, when they fall down, they're caught by that. And it doesn't really allow them to have the opportunity to really face the challenge, which can often heal them. And again, I do think that's related to this kind of cultural mother, if you will. It's too caring, and it doesn't speak to young men. It didn't speak to me. And again, I don't want to get too off topic, but because of my brother's difficulties, he was very often hanging out with people who had drug problems. And I remember he was hanging around with some heroin addicts once. And the government were basically providing these addicts with money for their housing and then money to spend. And they, because of some law that was passed, they couldn't tell the families what was going on. So essentially, they'd become supported by the state solely. And what are these addicts going to do when you give them all their housing money and all of the money for their monthly shop? They're going to spend it on drugs immediately. So basically, I was watching this in real time. And at that point, I was a young, naive lefty. But I was looking at this and thinking, this is not right. Like, you're basically subsidizing a drug addiction here by this sort of ill-judged desire to support someone. You're actually hurting them. So what the initiation process really points at is introducing men to that notion of standing on their own 2 feet, of introducing them to their adversity. So essentially, I've taken that up to the modern day, and we have to face the adversity within first. Whatever it is that's ailing that individual, the resentment, the anger, the pain, we have to go in and face those shadows. We have to overcome them and go through an almost a death and rebirth type experience. Now, once we've been through that, that's when we start to explore the elements I said earlier in the notion to father. We start at the very raw sense of being. What are you as a man? I'm very into the work of David Dada. He explores raw consciousness, if you like, as the kind of archetype of masculinity, because it's the archetype of still stoicism. So we start with that point, and then we build out into the sort of the cultural values that make up that individual, gives you a backbone, and then we finally build out into their life mission. And then we start to explore, with that, knowing what we now know, the feminine and the masculine energies, and how we actually relate to those in a healthy way, acknowledge their realities, but relate to them in a healthy way. So in essence, it gives men this deep grounding in a journey from this kind of inner boyhood, which is usually based upon blame and anger, into a more established manhood, which lets them walk on their own journey in their own path.
Thank you, Richard. Very interesting. You're talking there about how men and women are different when it comes to dealing with problems. The women getting some emotional relief from talking, and men wanting to provide solutions. I'm reminded of a video. I don't think I've ever done this in an ICMI interview before, but I'd love to show a video, and we'll do whatever editing is required. But first of all, I don't know if you know it. It's called "It's Not About the Nail."
I don't know it. No, I haven't seen it.
Okay. You're in for a treat, then, Richard.
She was saying, women, when they have negative emotions or whatever, they go and talk to their friends, and men don't. Men need to be more like women, and that would apparently mitigate the suicide rate. But actually, I wonder whether it would be more useful if women were more like men and men were more like men.
Beautifully put.
Well, I think there's something funny going on, isn't there? Because I remember it might have been the United Nations of Trade and Development or something. They tweeted out on the last International Men's Day, thank you to all the male allies in our intersectional fight. Thinking something doesn't quite add up.
Yeah.
Okay, let me try and
and the whole sort of oppressor-oppressed model is just so unuseful as well, and I think that feminism has been the most sort of significant quickener in that process. And so, obviously we have it, like you mentioned earlier, with our national identity, where we identify ourselves as oppressors and all the countries with brown people in the world as oppressed these days, when actually the truth is much more nuanced. And although that kind of idea is not a new idea, I think that feminism really cemented or the rise of feminism really cemented this dichotomous thinking, which is just so incredibly dysfunctional.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, well, again, I mean, I think there is this really funny thing going on in our culture. And, that really goes back to my woke
Yeah.
studies as well.
Mm.
A lot of people have been embedded in this ideology without even knowing it. They go and do
Oh,
an
yeah.
English course or a history course or a philosophy course, and they're being told, pretty much exclusively that this is just the way reality is, and they're told by these lecturers who seem very smart and very well put together, and they've got 20 years of experience writing their books on these topics, and you can easily fall into it. And again,
Well, yeah, but you don't even need to go to university. You get it in primary school.
yeah, I
Get
mean,
it
this
in
is
the
the thing.
mainstream
Yeah.
media. You get it from non-governmental organizations and the government. You get it from everyone.
Yeah, no,
Well,
again, I think
I
it
mean, the
has this.
mainstream media, as Elizabeth knows as well as anybody, that will not challenge feminist narratives, no matter how. I mean, one that we talk about a lot is domestic violence, and the Spectator, the magazine that we try to get an advert in, sorry, a one-page thing about telling the truth about domestic violence. They wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. But they have Julie Bindel, one of the most odious radical feminists of a generation. They've paid her to write 50 articles in recent years. And this is a woman who's made a career out of lying about domestic violence. Anyway, let's end on a lighter note. So it's not about the nail. I think you'll enjoy this.
It's just, there's all this pressure, And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
Yeah, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See,
out.
you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like there's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. Ow. If you would just...
Don't...
Try to see things my way.
21 million views, and every one of them merited. I thought you'd enjoy that.
So what's really interesting about that, sorry, just to butt in quickly, is, you get things like that, and you get the famous Gillette advert, and you look like that has got like loads of likes, 21 million views, loads of likes, 4,000 dislikes, massive like to dislike ratio. You have the Gillette advert, they spent all this money. It got absolutely destroyed, and then they obviously, I mean, I don't know if you follow it, but they started inflating the figures because they pretty much changed overnight.
Yeah, well, every time I went back to it,
public, people. Yeah, I was just saying that actual people out there seem to be more au fait with the message. Like they kind of get it, but it's more the mainstream itself almost wants to force everybody to believe it's the counter. But the average guy on the street,
go woke, go broke. Gillette's value. It was made by a feminist, that advert. What are the chances? And the company's value dropped by $8 billion as a result of that series of adverts.
So if you are interested in anything I said today, or in my work, the men's groups, you can check out all of my work on awakenedman.co.uk, my YouTube channel, which is just Awakened Man, and also my Instagram and my Facebook accounts, where we have few thousand men following, regular content, etc., etc. There's also links there to the link tree, which has got loads of freebies, all sorts of things you can check out, and also reach out to me if you'd like.
Thank you,
Richard. Thanks very much for a most interesting discussion. Thank you so much, and good luck with the Awakened Man.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and it was really great to meet you, Jen. I really do think the cause you're really fighting for is amazing. So really great to get to know you.
Likewise. And it's a wrap.
Again. Yes.